Getting the right reverb sound could be tricky, with common struggles like choosing the right reverb type, adjusting how long it lasts, and balancing how much you hear. It can be tough to keep your mix clear without things sounding too muddy or out of sync with the song, but still have the right depth and dimension that adds a nice spacey feel to your music. So in today's video, I'm going to show you the smartest way to dial in your reverb, making it easier for you to get that perfect balance and space within your tracks. But before we dial in any settings, we first must determine how we want to apply our reverb. When applying reverb, we could go about it in two ways. We could apply our reverb directly onto the track, which will blend the reverb with our original audio sound. Here's what that sounds like.
Had it before, run by the shore, this is a more.
Or we could apply our reverb using a send track, where we send a copy of the original audio signal to a separate reverb track that will let us control the sound of the reverb separately from our original audio signal. Here's what that sounds like.
Gotta live cool, but I had it before. I'm just coasting, smoking rounds by the shore. Everything Gucci, her shirt says I'm more. Nothing new, baby, but this is before. Everything cool, but it ain't what it seems. I'm the reason why she living her dreams. She the reason why I'm selling these dreams. Rips in her heart, there's rips in my jeans.
Now, there's pros and cons to using both methods. And if you're more experienced with audio production, then you're already smart enough to know the difference. But just as a refresher, and to provide new insight for those who may not know, applying reverb directly on the track is a quick and simple way to hear the effect immediately, which can make your sound more wet, but can also make it harder to control the overall sound of the reverb independently, because you're limited to the settings you have based on whatever reverb plugin you're using. And when you use reverb on a send track, you gain more control over the sound of your reverb because you can blend it in with the original signal and have the ability to add additional effects before or after your reverb, such as filters, saturators, modulation plugins, and delays, without affecting the original source signal. That can completely change the tone of your reverb, which opens up a new world of sounds and textures for your reverbs that you simply cannot get by just adding a reverb plugin directly to your original signal. But this takes a bit more time to set up and involves signal routing, which could be confusing for beginners at first. Regardless, it is still important to learn how to use both of these methods to your benefit based off the sounds that you're looking to achieve. Some examples of when I would apply reverb directly to a sound source is when I want something to sound really washed out and wet, or when I want to push a sound further back into my mix, such as ad-libs and background vocals.
Make it stop.
So that way there's separation between the sounds with reverb directly on the track versus the sounds I want more clear and upfront within my mixes. Now, when it comes to dialing in reverb with sends, I'll do that primarily when I want to blend the wet sound of my reverb without affecting my original dry audio signal, such as lead vocals to maintain the clarity, but add some sort of ambience and vibe to the track that complements the instrumental, further enhancing the vibe and feel for the rest of my mix.
Gotta live cool, but I had it before. I'm just coasting, smoking rounds by the shore. Everything Gucci, her shirt says I'm more. Nothing new, baby, but this is before. Gotta live cool, but I had it before. I'm just coasting, smoking rounds by the shore. Everything Gucci, her shirt says I'm more. Nothing new, baby, but this is before.
Not to mention the automation benefits you get from using a send, but that is a discussion for a later video. Simply understanding how and when we should apply reverb, whether it be directly onto our tracks or using a send, will instantly allow us to make smarter decisions as to how we want certain elements in our mix to sound and be placed. But for the rest of this video, we're going to be focusing on using sends because, again, that gives us the most flexibility to achieve a more tailored reverb sound. But enough of the basics, let's move on to some more big brain reverb tips. So when it comes to tweaking the actual settings on your reverb, there are two main controls for all reverb plugins you're going to want to understand in order to properly achieve your desired sound. The first parameter you're going to want to focus on is the pre-delay time, and the second parameter is going to be the decay. The pre-delay controls how long it takes for the reverb to start after the original sound is being played, like an echo that happens a split second later. Echo! This keeps the original sound of the reverb clear before the reverb kicks in, so that way your sound doesn't get too muddy or washed within your mix. And the decay time controls how long your reverb rings out for, letting you decide if the tail end of your reverb fades out quickly or lingers for a while. Learning how to use these knobs properly gives you more control over how big or small a space feels for whichever sound you apply reverb to in your mix. Now, the value for most of these pre-delay and decay knobs on reverbs are typically in seconds and milliseconds, which is fine but takes a bit more guesswork and fiddling around to try and find a good pre-delay and decay time that works nicely with your song. But did you know that you could make dialing in these two settings much easier, so that way you don't have to waste a bunch of time guessing which pre-delay and decay time you should be using? To do this, we just have to use a simple equation, so that way we nail our pre-delay and decay settings every single time. I'm going to explain the exact reason as to why this works, but for those who just want to know the equation to get everything up and running immediately, all you have to do is bring up your calculator and do 7500 divided by your BPM. So for this example, we're going to do 7500 divided by my current project's BPM, which is 107. And then we get this value here. After we get this initial value, the only thing we have to do is multiply or divide by 2 a few times to get our pre-delay and decay settings. So what I usually like to do is get my pre-delay first. So what I'm going to do is take this value and divide that by 2. And as you can see here, we then get this value, which is going to be our pre-delay in milliseconds. But once we get our pre-delay number value, then all we have to do is simply input the first 4 digits of this number into our pre-delay settings in our reverb. So since I have this value here, 35.04, I'm going to pull that into the pre-delay time of my reverb. And as you can see here, it's already dialed into 35.04. But if you guys had a different value for whatever reason, just type in whatever value you're using and then you're good to go for your pre-delay time. To get to our decay time, we just have to return to the initial value we got from dividing 7500 by our BPM, which is easier to do if your calculator has a history tab on it. So I'm going to click here to bring that initial value back up and then multiply by 2 a few times to get our decay time. So if I multiply by 2 once, we get this value, and if I multiply by 2 one more time, we get this value. But before we input any of these values into the decay section of our reverb, we first must look at the decimal point shown and then move it over to the left twice to get our final decay value. So for this example, since we got 280.37, you could just ignore everything to the right of the decimal point and then just move the decimal point over to the left twice, and then as you can see, we would get 2.80. So as you can see here, if we go back to our reverb plugin, you can see that I had already inputted that value. But again, if you need to input it again, just put 2.80 or whatever value you get for your BPM in your project, and then you're good to go. Once both of these values are set, the only thing left for you to do is listen and determine if you like the sound of these pre-delay and decay settings for your song. Again, the two main things you're going to want to focus on to make it easier for you when you listen is how long it takes for the reverb to kick in and how long it takes the reverb to fade out in between phrases. One tip that I like to use when listening to the decay time specifically is I'll play whatever I'm dialing in my reverb on, and then I'll stop the playback and listen to how long my reverb tail rings out, so I can then determine if that's the decay length I'm going for my song. Here's what that looks like.
You've been on timing, let me control your body.
So as you can see, I just really listened to that tail end of the reverb, which for this song, I think that sounds great. If for whatever reason you want a shorter or longer pre-delay time, you could go back to the equation and use some of the other values you got instead. So since we use this value, which was 35.04 for our pre-delay time, we could also use the value above for a shorter pre-delay time, meaning that it's going to take less time for the reverb to kick in after the original sound is played, which generally pushes sounds further back into the mix.
You've been on timing, let me control your body. Don't even mind your games, cause you's a hardy. We can get away, hey baby, let's lose this party. Took shots of tequila, now she can't refuse this body.
Or we could use the value below, which would be 70.09, which gives us a longer pre-delay time that makes it longer for the reverb to kick in after the original sound is being played, which will further separate the reverb from our original signal, giving us more space and clarity between these two elements within the mix.
You've been on timing, let me control your body. Don't even mind your games, cause you's a hardy. We can get away, hey baby, let's lose this party. Took shots of tequila, now she can't refuse this body.
Same thing for the decay. If you want a shorter value, return to the initial value provided from dividing 7500 by the BPM and multiply by 2 a few times to see your options. Since we use the value of 280 for our decay time, we could use the one below if we don't want our reverb to ring out as long, which in this case would be 140 or 1.40 when you input that into the decay time of your reverb. This will give us more of a subtle small room type of sound.
You've been on timing, let me control your body. Don't even mind your games, cause you's a hardy. We can get away, hey baby, let's lose this party. Took shots of tequila, now she can't refuse this body.
So as you can see for this example, if you really paid attention, it dies out in between the phrases, which isn't really that much of a lush feel, which is why I think 2.80 was perfect for this song. But if you wanted a longer decay time, then you could use the value above, which in this case would be 560 or 5.60 when you input that into the decay section of your reverb, which in this case would make our reverb tail much longer, giving us that lush wet sound if that's something that you desire.
You've been on timing, let me control your body. Don't even mind your games, cause you's a hardy. We can get away, hey baby, let's lose this party. Took shots of tequila, now she can't refuse this body.
So as you can hear, the tail end of that reverb is much longer. Now the settings you choose are obviously going to be very song dependent, but as a general rule of thumb, typically for a very fast, tight flowed rap vocal, I'll usually use a more open pre-delay time, so that way the reverb isn't pushing my vocals too far back, getting in the way of my performance. And I'll use a smaller decay time, so that way the rap vocals are still sitting in a reverberated space that is subtle, but isn't too distracting within the mix.
You the type to claim you're real, but end up switch by at the end. I can never keep it 50, I keep it 100 to the end. I'm thankful for these struggles, see it made me who I am. Always saying that's on me, not my mama or my friends.
If I have a song where the artist is singing or is just more melodic with their delivery and reverb is required to create a really ambient vibe and space, then that's when I'll opt for a longer decay time. And then I play around with my different pre-delay values until I get a blend of something that I like.
I'm here, now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
Now, these values are not hard set in stone. You obviously could deviate away from the numbers you get by using this equation, but by using this method, it helps you to get to a good starting point quicker where your pre-delay and decay settings sound best for your music, which saves you a bunch of time, making it an easier and smarter way for you to dial in those reverb settings. Now, you may be asking yourself, where did you get that 7500 value? Or be saying 7500, I thought we were supposed to use 60,000 and divide by our BPM time to calculate our reverb times, which isn't wrong necessarily, but I found to be a much more clunky method when calculating our reverb values. Let me explain. To further understand, we first must figure out why people are using the 60,000 value to begin with. And the main reason why people use this 60,000 value is because there are 60,000 milliseconds in 1 minute. So since BPM is short for beats per minute, when we divide 60,000 milliseconds by our BPM, we get the equivalent value of a quarter note in milliseconds, which is why using 60,000 divided by our BPM works. But personally, I don't like using 60,000 because it is one too many clicks to input into the calculator, and the value that it gives us is usually way too long for a usable decay time in most songs. But what most people don't know is that if you divide 60,000 by 2 multiple times, you get different values that you could use as a starting point for your calculations, instead of that standard 60,000 millisecond value. So if 60,000 divided by our BPM gives us a quarter note value in milliseconds, then that means when you divide 60,000 by 2, you get 30,000 milliseconds, which if you plug this value in and divide by your BPM, you'll get an eighth note in milliseconds. And the pattern continues. Divide 30,000 by 2 and get 15,000, which when divided by our BPM will give you a 16th note in milliseconds. Divide 15,000 by 2, and as you can see here, we get 7,500, which is where our 7,500 value comes from. That gives us a 32nd note when divided by the BPM. And then divide that by 2, which gives us 3,750, which gives us a 64th note. Then divide that by 2, which gives us 1875, which is equivalent to a 128th note, all in milliseconds. The main reason why I use 7,500 is because it is smack in the middle of where I want to be note-wise. Since I like to keep things simple and only divide or multiply by 2, if I use 60,000 divided by our BPM, which in this case for this song we'll use 119, I would have to divide by 2 4 or 5 times just to get my pre-delay value, which is too many clicks for me. As you can see here, I'm gonna divide by 2, we get that, we get this, we get this, we get this, and finally we get a usable pre-delay value. Versus if I use 7,500 divided by our BPM, which is 119, and as you can see here, I just have to divide by 2 once, and then we get our pre-delay value instantly. And then again, jump back to that initial value, multiply by 2 twice, and as you can see here, we get 2 values right here on this side for our decay time. Hey, if all of this sounds too complicated just for some reverb settings, I feel you. It's not meant for everybody. But if you just rather focus on recording the music and have somebody else handle the mixing and mastering for you to make sure your songs sound absolutely phenomenal for your next release, then I got you. To get your next song mixed and mastered, click the link down below to fill out a mix request form where you could submit the details for your next project, and we'll have your song sounding great in no time. Now back into the video. Once you have your pre-delay and decay settings locked in, then it's time to select which reverb type you want to use in your song. Now, I'm not going to go over the origin of each reverb type and where it comes from. I just want to provide you with a general characteristic of the sound that each reverb type provides, along with some practical examples that you could use to choose your reverb sounds more effectively. And if you guys wanted to download some of my custom reverb presets to try them out for yourselves, I'm going to leave some more information about that at the end of the video. But our first reverb type is going to be a room reverb. Like the name implies, room reverbs are designed to replicate the acoustics of indoor rooms that can typically range from a 0.2 to 1 second decay time, which creates a small sense of space and depth for your sounds, which isn't too noticeable. That could add liveliness to a dry recording, putting it in a subtle ambient space.
I'm here, now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
Room reverbs work great if you have a dry sounding vocal that you want to liven up a bit without having a distracting noticeable tail, or if you have some dry drum sounds that you want to give the impression of recording in a live room. Our next reverb type is a plate reverb. Unlike the natural sound of a room reverb, plate reverbs use a large metal plate to create their reverb sounds that typically range anywhere between 1 to 3 seconds of decay time.
I'm here.
Plate reverbs aren't very dense but are known more for their smooth, lighter, and brighter character that is often used on lead vocals in pop or rock records because it adds a sense of presence and smoothness to your mix without sounding too distant.
I'm here, now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
I personally like to add plate reverbs whenever I want something to subtly sit in a brighter space without having to use any additional EQ on my sound source to achieve that brightness. Also, whenever I want to add more width to my vocals. Since plate reverbs aren't very dense, they don't usually provide that front to back depth that you get from other reverb types, but rather more left to right stereo information, which could add more width to your mixes. If you wanted a sound that's more noticeable and has more depth, then you could use our next reverb type, which would be a hall reverb. Hall reverbs are designed to replicate the acoustics of natural spaces, such as concert halls or any large indoor space, that typically has a decay time that ranges anywhere between 2 to 5 seconds.
I'm here.
But depending on how big the space is, these reverbs could ring out for much longer, which makes them easier to hear and pick out within the mix, but also much easier to make them sound very muddy or washed out, which is something we have to be aware of when dialing this reverb type in.
I'm here, now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
This reverb type can be applied to any vocal or instrument you want to sound more dramatic in the mix, which is something that I use often whenever I want a very dense and present wet reverb sound. Our last reverb type that we're going to be going over today is the chamber reverb. Chamber reverbs work great whenever you want a reverb sound that is more balanced and controlled when being compared to a hall reverb, but still have more depth and dimension when compared to a room or plate reverb. Chamber reverbs typically have a decay time between 1.5 to 3 seconds.
I'm here.
That provide a dense, smooth sound that makes it subtle for adding depth and fullness to a mix without pushing elements too far back or being too distracting.
I'm here, Now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
This is the reverb type I usually reach for first because it still provides me with that present deep reverb sound that I'm usually looking for without making my sound too washed out. Now I did leave out two reverb types, which are the spring reverb and convolution or impulse response reverb, only because those are used for very specific situations, but the ones I mentioned are the ones that you're going to be seeing most often. Learning the different reverb types and how they can be used is super important for mixing because each different type of reverb adds a specific space and sound that will provide you with different feelings throughout your music. Knowing which reverb type to choose for your song can make your sound up close and natural or big and distant, which helps you control how much space and depth you want in your mix, keeping everything sounding clear and balanced instead of messy, muddy, and cluttered. On the note of keeping your mixes sounding clear and free from mud and clutter, another thing that'll also benefit the sound of your reverbs is if you use filters. Since we're using reverbs on sends, that gives us the most control over how much we're able to filter our reverb, giving us a more dialed in sound.
I'm here. Now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there. I'm here. Now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
The reason why we do this is because although the different reverb types play a huge role in how our reverb will sound within our mix, just going off the reverb type alone will not guarantee a proper fit for what we will need for our mix. This is where the filters come in. So typically, I like to filter my reverbs in two ways, either before the reverb plugin or after the reverb plugin on my send. I'll usually filter before my reverb plugin whenever I don't want certain information coming from the original sound to be present within my reverb tail. So let's say I'm working with a vocal that has a lot of low mids and body that I do not want my reverb to reflect and ring out.
You the type to claim you're real but end up switch bad at the end. I can never keep it 50, I keep it 100 to the end.
Then I'll usually filter out the low end on my send before the reverb, so that way I'm not getting any low to low mid frequencies ringing out within the tail end of my reverb.
You the type to claim you're real but end up switch bad at the end. I can never keep it 50, I keep it 100 to the end. I'm thankful for these struggles, see it made me who I am. I'm always saying that's on me, not my mama or my friends.
Another pro tip is if you're sending a very dynamic signal to your reverb, then the chances of the sound of your reverb coming in and out within your mix are going to be very high.
You the type to claim you're real but end up switch bad at the end. I can never keep it 50, I keep it 100 to the end. I'm thankful for these struggles, see it made me who I am. I'm always saying that's on me, not my mama or my friends.
To fix this, I'll usually add a compressor after my EQ but before my reverb, so that way it compresses my signal going into my reverb, which will then give me a smoother tail that is more consistent within the mix.
You the type to claim you're real but end up switch bad at the end. I can never keep it 50, I keep it 100 to the end. I'm thankful for these struggles, see it made me who I am. I'm always saying that's on me, not my mama or my friends.
When it comes to filtering after my reverb plugin on my send, I'll usually do that once I get a reverb sound that I like, but want to be more in control of. So let's say I decide on using a plate reverb that is very bright in my mix.
I'm here. Now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there.
To control how much brightness my reverb is adding, I'll usually use a low-pass filter after my reverb plugin, so that way I'm in control over how much brightness I'm getting from my reverb.
I'm here. Now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there. There's a cloud inside her mind, you better take cover. Cause whoa, she just like the rain. I can't get away, she just like the rain.
The same concept could be applied if I'm using a hall reverb, for example, and I want to filter out some of the low to low mids, so that way I'm not getting too much body within my reverb tail that can make my mix sound very muddy or cloudy, ruining the clarity of my mix. This is why using reverb on a send gives us much more control and flexibility over the sound of our reverb, because you could use a wider range of plugins both before and after the reverb plugin on the send to give your reverbs a more unique, tailored sound. And it doesn't just stop with filters. You could use all sorts of plugins both before and after your reverb, such as saturation, modulation, delays, and much more to level up the sound and feeling of your reverbs. But just having a cool reverb sound isn't the only thing you must keep track of. When dialing in reverb, it is also very important to consider the instrumentation of the song, so that way you could use that to your advantage whenever selecting your reverbs. So since we already discussed whether we should use a reverb on a track or a send, choosing the right pre-delay and decay time, understanding the different reverb types and how they sound, and using filters both before and after our reverb along with additional effects, we can then use all that knowledge to our advantage when dialing in and selecting different reverbs based off the given instrumental of the song. So this song, for example, it is a much darker and moodier type of song that doesn't have too much high-end frequencies within the instrumental. So when choosing our reverbs, we have two options. We could use something that complements that dark moody sound by using a darker hall or chamber reverb sound, or we could do the complete opposite and use a reverb that contrasts that dark sound, which is something like a plate reverb, which will add a little bit more brightness into our mix. Now for the original mix of this song, we used a hall reverb, which sounded like this.
I'm here, now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there. There's a cloud inside of mine, you better.
Which again is a dark sounding reverb that complements that moody feeling, but when I was playing with this video, I actually did like the contrast of the bright plate reverb.
I'm here, now she see it clear as diamonds, no one's there. There's a cloud inside of mine, you better.
So as you can hear, there's a little bit more sizzle and presence within that reverb tail, which is making it sound more lush and full. So the choice is yours. Another thing to consider is that you could also use a combination of these different reverb types to get an even more tailored sound. So if you wanted something with a little bit of room presence but the tail of a chamber, you could combine those two and get the best of both worlds. Realistically speaking, if you really wanted to, you could use all the different reverb types for one signal, but just understanding how each reverb type sounds, what characteristic it will bring to your mix, and how you could process it further by adding effects both before or after your reverb plugin will make it that much easier for you to make smarter choices when choosing the right reverb for your mix. And if you guys wanted to use some of the custom reverb sounds that I use in my mixes, then you could download my custom reverb pack that I've made for you guys to enjoy. The link for that will be in the description down below, along with some additional details of how to load it in. And if you guys wanted to try out a free version of this reverb pack, then you could just join my Patreon as a free member with no additional cost to you and get instant access to a light version of this pack, so you can go ahead and hear how that sounds in your mixes. And to continue learning about how to get a better sound for your music, then check out this video right here where I go deep in depth on how to apply additional processing to your vocals to make them stand out in your mixes aside from using reverb. I'll see you guys there. Peace.